Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into something so many of us experience, but honestly, very few of us actually understand. So if you've ever stared down a slice of pizza or a massive bowl of ice cream with this weird mix of longing and, well, total dread, you are definitely in the right place. We're unpacking the dairy dilemma. And I want to kick things off by letting you in on a little secret, and this is genuinely fascinating. That dairy dread, the bloating, the cramping, the sheer discomfort, it's completely 100% biologically natural. 75%. Think about that for a second. That's the percentage of the global adult population that cannot efficiently digest lactose, which means if a glass of milk leaves you feeling absolutely awful, you're not broken. You don't have some rare disease. You are actually the global norm. The medical world likes to call this lactose malabsorption, but if we really flip the script here, the people who can just chug a glass of milk with zero issues, they're the actual biological outliers. We're going to explore exactly why that is, and way more importantly, how modern science is actually figuring out ways to hack our own biology to fix it. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. First, the global dairy dilemma. Then, the evolution of tolerance, the gut's gas factory, the breath test, hacking the microbiome. And finally, we'll wrap up with the prebiotic solution. Part 1, the global dairy dilemma, reframing the problem. First off, I really want to validate the digestive pain that you, or maybe someone you know, goes through after eating dairy. It's super real, it's incredibly uncomfortable, and it all boils down to a very specific biological mechanism. To get the why behind the pain, we have to look at how our bodies are basically programmed to handle milk from day one. See, lactose is just a sugar found in milk, and to absorb it, our small intestine has to produce an enzyme called lactase. Human infants naturally pump out plenty of lactase to digest their mother's milk. Obviously, it's absolutely crucial for survival. But Mother Nature has a built-in timer. For the vast majority of humans, the production of this enzyme naturally and sharply drops off after weaning, usually right around age 2. This natural baseline state, that's known as lactase non-persistence, or LNP. Your body literally shuts the factory down. The alternative, where the factory manages to stay open your entire life, is actually a genetic adaptation called lactase persistence, or LP. Moving right along to part 2, the evolution of tolerance, a genetic twist. So, you might be wondering, if the default human setting is to shut down lactase production after infancy, and humans technically aren't even meant to drink milk as adults, why do some of us do it so incredibly well? Well, the answer lies in human history and a pretty wild genetic twist. Normally, we see this biological progression, really high lactase in infancy, followed by a totally natural drop at weaning. But millennia ago, human behavior stepped in. Certain ancient pastoralist communities, in places like northwestern Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Africa, started domesticating milk-producing livestock. Because they relied so heavily on dairy to survive, over thousands of years, a selective genetic advantage actually emerged. Specific genetic mutations, like the C13910 to T variant found in European populations, essentially allowed that lactase factory to stay open all the way into adulthood. It wasn't an overnight thing, right? It was the slow, localized evolutionary adaptation. Which brings us to part 3, the gut's gas factory, microscopic battles. All right, let's shift our focus from big picture global genetics all the way down to the microscopic wars happening right inside your large intestine. If you don't happen to have that genetic mutation, what actually happens when you drink a glass of milk? Well, if you lack that lactase enzyme, the lactose sugar just passes totally undigested straight into your large intestine, where your gut bacteria throw an absolute feast. Think of your gut microbiome like a giant engine. In a lot of us, lactose is fed into these gas-producing bacteria, like Bacteroides and Clostridium. These are kind of like old smog-producing engines. When they ferment the lactose, they aggressively pump out hydrogen, carbon dioxide, and methane gas. And that gas expands, causing all that painful bloating and flatulence we associate with lactose intolerance. But there is another type of engine in your gut. These are the clean energy bacteria, primarily bifidobacteria, and they use this incredibly cool, unique metabolic pathway called the bifid shunt. When bifidobacteria ferment lactose, they produce lactate and acetate, but absolutely zero gas. Let's look at part 4, the breath test, measuring the smog. So, obviously, the key to comfort is having the right kind of bacteria doing the digesting. But how do doctors actually figure out which engines are running inside your gut? Let's see how this builds step by step using what's called the hydrogen breath test, which is honestly beautifully simple. First, a patient ingests a standard 25-gram dose of lactose. That's about the equivalent of chugging 2 glasses of milk. Now, if they're intolerant, that lactose hits the colon, where those smog-producing bacteria start furiously fermenting it. Step 3 is where the biological magic happens. The hydrogen gas produced in the colon actually diffuses directly into the patient's bloodstream, travels all the way up to the lungs, and gets exhaled. So, by simply having the patient breathe into a machine, doctors can measure the hydrogen in parts per million. A massive spike in hydrogen just means your gut is running those gas-producing engines. Up next, Part 5, Hacking the Microbiome, the Prebiotic Strategy. Okay, so if the pain comes from the wrong bacteria fermenting the dairy, we have to ask a pretty provocative question. What if we could train our gut to handle dairy? Like, what if we didn't have to just rely on some ancient genetic lottery, but could actually hack our own microbiome to favor those clean energy engines? Enter the prebiotic strategy. Specifically, we're talking about a prebiotic called galacto-oligosaccharides, or GOS for short. GOS is a specific chain of galactose sugars that humans literally do not have the enzymes to digest. And honestly, that is exactly why it's so incredibly powerful. Because we can't digest it, it survives the entire journey all the way down to a large intestine completely intact. And once it's there, it acts like a highly targeted fertilizer. It completely bypasses those gas-producing smog engines and specifically feeds and multiplies the clean energy bacteria. Now, what's really interesting about this is how direct the pathway is. When you consume GOS, it goes straight to your gut microbiota and supercharges those specific lactose-metabolizing bacteria, like bifidobacteria and lactobacillus. Because you're essentially artificially inflating their numbers, the next time you eat dairy, these clean energy bacteria completely outcompete the gas-producing ones. They rapidly ferment the lactose using that totally gas-free bifid shunt pathway we talked about earlier. And the result? A massive decrease in gas production, way less osmotic pressure drawing water into your colon, and a huge reduction in diarrhea and bloating. You are quite literally restructuring your gut's entire ecosystem.
Finally, Part 6, the prebiotic solution, clinical proof.
I know, it sounds a bit like biological science fiction, doesn't it? But we're not just talking about theory here. In a randomized, double-blind clinical trial led by researcher Askar Perel, subjects with confirmed lactose intolerance were given escalating doses of a highly purified GOS supplement over 35 days. And the results? A staggering 90% of the subjects saw a major increase in the relative abundance of bifidobacteria in their gut. 90%! That is huge. They successfully managed to shift the entire composition of the microbiome to favor the exact bacteria that process lactose without creating all that painful gas. And this brilliantly illustrates what happens when these biological changes translate to real life. This data is from another major study by Shane and his colleagues, which looked at 377 lactose-intolerant participants. The group taking the GOS prebiotic had a 78% rate of increased bifidobacteria, which completely blew the placebo group out of the water. But more importantly, post-trial, they were able to comfortably consume about 1.5 cups of milk per day, compared to just a tiny fraction, 0.2 cups, for the placebo group. The GOS group fundamentally expanded what their bodies could tolerate. So let's wrap up the key takeaways of this explainer. By using prebiotics like GOS, patients experience significantly decreased cramping, bloating, and diarrhea. This is because that rapid fermentation of lactose by those newly cultivated clean energy bacteria really limits the osmotic pressure that causes diarrhea, all while utilizing that amazing gas-free bifid shunt pathway. But actually, scratch that, it's a huge but. There's a very firm, absolute, crucial caveat here. These microbiome shifts, they're transient. They don't last forever. If you stop feeding those clean energy bacteria their preferred fertilizer, their numbers are going to eventually drop right back down to baseline. Habitual, consistent consumption of the prebiotic is required to maintain the tolerance. It's basically daily maintenance for your gut garden. So what does this all mean? It leaves us with a truly fascinating idea to ponder. We've just seen how we can literally reprogram our own internal ecosystems to overcome a massive genetic hurdle like lactose intolerance. So the real question is, if we can hack our gut to comfortably process dairy, what other dietary limitations, allergies, or intolerances could we potentially overcome in the future, simply by feeding our microbiome the exact right fuel? It completely changes how we think about the food we eat and the trillions of microscopic helpers digesting it all for us. Thank you so much for joining me today on this explainer, and I really hope this changes the way you look at your next slice of pizza.